we're learning about today is interleaved teaching. It's an approach that helps students really internalize those effective practice strategies naturally without you repeating yourself endlessly. So this method is backed by research across fields like music, math, and sports, and it is proven to get better results than traditional block practice. Today's session is all about how we can teach this kind of practice right in our piano lessons so that our students are successful at home. Nicola Cantan is a piano teacher, writer, and creator who believes piano students learn best through laughter, improvisation, composition, and games. And she's the creative force behind vibrant music teaching and vivid practice. And if you've heard of both of those, you know that she has shared a lot in terms of this type of topic. And what I love most about Nicola is she just really makes the pedagogy practical. It's immediately usable. It's not like it's theory, just research. This is how you can actually do it. Let's dive in. Nicola, please go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, Rosemary. And it's a pleasure to be back with APTA, one of my favourite organisations, seriously. Even though it's virtual this time, it's great to be back with you all. And I'm excited to dive into today's presentation. So we're going to be talking about interleaved teaching, as Rosemary mentioned. Before I get to any of that, I just want to make a couple of notes myself. First of all, try not to do a bunch of other stuff at the same time. I mean, I'm not offended or whatever if you're multitasking, but you really will get so much more out of this if you tap into the session and also the community, right? That you're paying attention to what others are saying in the chat, what the presentation is about, and maybe taking some notes in a notebook, rather than trying to get a bunch of things done at the same time. And please do ask questions. If they're more in-depth, as Rosemary said, we'll come back to them at the end, but generally I'm able to keep track and answer as we go. So if there's anything I say that's unclear, pronouncing something weird, and you don't know what I said, literally it's fine to just ask me. If there's something you want more clarity on, please let me know, or just examples, other questions as we go through. That's the whole magic of a live workshop, so make sure you ask your questions and don't be shy in the chat. And then in the question session at the end, if you have a more in-depth question that you want to come on camera and tell me, come on mic, then we'll leave space for that too. So first, just the big picture of what we're going to cover today. We're going to go through practice types, blocked, spaced, and interleaved practice and how those apply in our teaching and in our students' practice, what they're all about. We're going to look at how this applies to our actual teaching so that students practice well. And I'm going to make sure that you're able to implement it. So again, that comes back to the questions. If there's anything that's unclear, if you're not quite sure how it would look in a lesson, feel free to tell me and I will give another example. I'm always happy to explain further. Before we get to that, Rosemary already introduced a little bit of what I do. You may know me from Vibrant Music Teaching, Vivid Practice, Colourful Keys is our blog. I also have a podcast, YouTube channel, and a bunch of books. So if I seem familiar and you don't know where from, it might be one of those. I'm from Dublin in Ireland. And so we're going to start with a little bit of an experiment inspired by my own country. This is just an experiment to set up a little bit about what blocked practice and interleaved practice are, but don't worry if you don't get what we're doing right away. Just go with the flow and I will explain everything again and make sure it's very clear. So our experiment is going to involve you learning some of the Irish language, which is not called Gaelic. So I just thought I'd cover that here before we get started and I confuse anyone by calling it Irish. That is what we call the Irish language. We speak English here. That's our number one language, but we do have our own language as well that some people speak. I am by no means fluent despite studying it all through school because it's obligatory. But yeah, we're going to do a little bit of an experiment and you're going to learn some Irish, or in Irish it's called Gaeilge, which is where the confusion with the word Gaelic comes from. Total side note, but Gaelic here means a particular sport called Gaelic football. So all gets very confusing. Our first phrase we will learn through blocked practice. And we're going to learn how to say hello, how are you in Irish. Fair warning, Irish is not an easy language. I want you to do your best to say it along with me, especially as we repeat it. So hello is dia gwit. How are you is Cunis atá tú. We'll repeat that. Dia gwit.
Dia gwit.
Cunis atá tú.
Cunis atá tú.
And maybe Rosemary can mute anyone who didn't find their mute button there in the chat. That's great. Okay, again. Here we go. Dia gwit. Cunis atá tú. Dia gwit. We're going to keep repeating ourselves. Cunis atá tú. Dia gwit. 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 Cunis atá tú. I'm trying to get faster each time. Okay. That's it. Now we're going to learn some different Irish phrases, and we're going to use interleaved practice, or we're just going to alternate between two phrases. Simplest form of interleaved practice. So the first one is thank you. In English, very simple. I'm so sorry. In Irish, it is go rev ma agat. Literally means may goodness be with you. Please is go ma leiscéal. Again, I'm sorry. I know. It's difficult. Go rev ma agat is thank you. Please is go ma leiscéal. Thank you. Go rev ma agat. Please, go ma leiscéal. By the way, I chose to use those words for my next example because I'm visiting Canada, and the thing that Ireland and Canada has in common is the need to be polite at all times. So that's why I went for those two as our examples. Okay, we'll come back to our little experiment later, but for now we'll dive into talking about blocked practice, spaced practice, then interleaved practice, and then interleaved teaching. So starting with blocked practice, what is that? It just means practicing one thing and then the next, like you're following a checklist. So here's an example of a student doing blocked practice. They might spend 3 minutes, if we're lucky, on scales, and then 5 minutes on a piece called Bluesy Dude, and 6 minutes on Prancing Pixie, and then maybe 1 minute on the annoyingly difficult Etude. That's block practice. They're just doing one thing. When they're done, they're finished with it. Hopefully they've repeated each thing a few times during that time. Hopefully they've paid attention to any other notes you have on the score. But they've done one thing at a time and moved on until they're done. Now the pros of block practice. It's simple. It barely needs an explanation. Most students understand this. Most students don't need you to talk about this. This is what they will do. If you don't explain any form of practice, they'll probably do some form of blocked practice. It's fairly easy for parents to reinforce if they're working on practice with their child at home. They can make sure all the assignments are getting done because it's very clear to follow that the student is checking everything off on a list. And it may not be perfect, but honestly, I'm sure many of you will agree with this, it's good enough. If students are doing some practice, sometimes we're winning. So this is definitely heaps better than no practice at all. And it might not be the most efficient way to practice, but it's still pretty good, especially if they complete their whole list. I think we're doing well in a lot of cases if they do that. What are the cons of it though? Well, it's a bit inefficient. They definitely could be getting more done in the same amount of time, as we'll talk about in our interleaved section. It can be monotonous and their brain can switch off because it's not being challenged, especially if they're just repeating things without thinking for whatever length of time and then moving on to the next thing. They might not be using their brain actively enough. And in some ways it's a bit too simplistic. Some students will just think of practice as putting in the time or the repetitions. And again, that's fine for a beginner, but as we move forward, it might not be what we're looking for from students. Okay, let's see if we remember. You don't need to type it in the chat or anything, but have a go saying it. Do we remember what thank you was? Go rev ma agat. Go rev ma agat. And what about please? Go mo leshkeo. Okay, space practice. I'd be interested to hear in the chat if anyone remembered those phrases. I know it's difficult. Let's move on and talk about spaced practice. Spaced practice is about including breaks between repetitions or work on a specific area. And just like Rosemary said earlier, spaced practice and interleaved practice have been studied in all sorts of different areas, in music, in maths, in various sports studies, to prove that they are more efficient than just blocked or what's sometimes called massed practice. So spaced practice is incredibly simple, especially if we're just talking about one specific piece. We do a little bit of the piece, we do something else, we leave a space. So, for example, the student goes and does their school homework, and then they come back to the piano, amazing, and they do Bluesy Dude again. And then maybe they go and have their snack, and then they do Bluesy Dude again. So they've come back to it several times. That's what spaced practice is. There's just space between when we're working on it. Now, the magic of this is about making your brain work harder, and it's about something called the forgetting curve. This is just my own simplistic illustration for our purposes of the forgetting curve. It's not based on a study, one specific study. But roughly, the forgetting curve looks something like this. And when we look across the horizontal axis, we're thinking about time. And when we look across the vertical axis, we're thinking about the amount we forgot. So basically we start off, we've just done the thing, we remember 100% of it, and then as soon as we stop doing the thing, whatever it is, whether it's playing tennis or learning Spanish or playing piano, we start forgetting it. It starts going away. And our job is to try and do it again before we've totally forgotten it, because otherwise we're just starting from scratch. So more time passes and we pick it up again. We've already forgot 40% of it, but we pick it up again so we remember 100%. And then we start forgetting it again, slightly slower this time. And then we pick it up again and we start forgetting it again. So each time we come back to it, our forgetting curve gets a little bit less steep. And therefore we're forgetting it a little bit slower. And we come back to it again, and we come back to it again. I've chosen 5 here to illustrate what we hope our students are doing, practicing 5 days a week, right? They give themselves a day to forget something, and then hopefully they do it again the next day before they have totally forgotten it. And each time they will forget it a little bit slower. I'm sure you've experienced this in your own playing, as well as your own teaching. Say you had a memorized piece. The more time you spent learning it and recalling it over and over and over many months, the longer you will retain it. But at some point, if you never play it again for 20 years and you try and play it again, it will be gone, right? So it takes a lot of repetitions and a lot of calling back the same information or the same skill in order for our brains to store it in our long-term memory and say, hey, this looks like something we should just keep, rather than relearning it again and again. The analogy I like to use for this for students is a train. This is going to sound a little bit goofy, but it works for me and my students anyway. So I ask them to picture a train station right at the front of their head. Just behind their forehead, there's a train station. And the train is at the station when we're working on the thing. So let's say we're practicing that piece called Bluesy Dude. Bluesy Dude, right at the train station, it's there. As soon as we stop playing Bluesy Dude, the train starts leaving the station. And it's going to drive from the front of our head to the back of our head and then exit. So it goes zooming through our head and it's speeding up as it goes. That's the forgetting curve in action. So the train is getting faster and faster as it goes through our head. And our job is to then stop the train, call it back to the station before it gets out the back of our head, because otherwise we have to build a whole new train in the station again the next time. So what are the pros of spaced practice then? Well, it's more manageable for some students. I emphasize the some here. But for some students, this is easier to fit into the day because it's shorter chunks of time. It gives them forgetting time. And the quicker we call back that information, the less we have forgotten, right? So the less hard we have to work and the stronger our memory gets. So a normal practice is to wait until hopefully the next day and they practice again. But if they recall that several hours later, they've forgotten even less, so it gets more efficient. And our brain stays engaged. We have to work harder because we're not just practicing it in one big chunk. We're coming back to it later when we've had a chance to forget some of it. What are the cons, though? Well, it's harder to manage for many parents and for many students. It's already difficult enough to remind students to practice one time during the day. We're asking them for several different chunks of practice. So for some, that's going to make it easier. For most, I would say, it's going to make it harder. And every time you practice, it feels difficult. When we practice one thing, and we just do it a bunch of times in a row, we have an illusion of mastery. We feel like we're getting so much better so quickly. It turns out it's not the truth, but that is still how it feels. So even when you know these facts, you may do it in your own practice. Even when you know that interleaved practice is better, some days you just won't be up for it. And you'll say, nope, I just want to play it 10 times in a row. I just want to keep repeating it until I feel like I'm getting better at it. So that's a hard ask, especially for younger students. It also takes longer overall to do the same amount of practice. Now, it is more efficient, but there's always some setting up time, right? They need to go to the piano, they need to set up their book or move their books around between different pieces, whatever they're doing. And so overall, it does take a little bit more time. Okay, we're coming back to it. Do we remember what comes next? Ga, rev, mahagat. And ga, ma, leshkale. Okay, interleaved practice then. The title. The big element. What's it all about? Well, this is basically about layering practice items to space out repetitions of each thing. So this is what it might look like, and this looks complicated at first. We'll talk it through. So let's say a student does 2 minutes of their scales, and then they do 3 minutes of Bluesy Dude, and then they do the annoyingly difficult etude, and then they go back to Bluesy Dude, and then scales, and then the annoyingly difficult etude again, and then scales again, and then the prancing pixie. If you want to add these sessions up, by the way, all the examples I give are the same amount of time in total. But it's a lot more to track. That's the basic idea of interleaved practice, is we're going between different things and repeating things in some kind of pattern or in some way that feels randomized even. We're going to be interrupting ourselves before we feel like we've mastered something, and then coming back again later. So it keeps us on our toes. It keeps us working. It keeps us awake for the entire session, the whole time. We have to keep paying attention. We can't just go into auto mode. They can still schedule one big practice session if that's what they'd prefer. So unlike spaced practice, it doesn't have to be split up. We're splitting it up with the different items on our list, which is what makes it work for a lot of different students. And many studies have shown that this is more effective. I have to say, not more effective than spaced practice. I think they're equal and they're almost alternatives to each other. But this way of working produces stickier and more durable learning, again and again in lots of different industries and skill areas. What are the downsides though? Well, if we want to practice like this, we actually have to practice practicing like this. So we're learning yet another skill in order to practice this way. We have to teach our students this skill. They have to be willing to put in the time practicing and getting used to working this way because it is not intuitive, unlike blocked practice. And it feels difficult, just like our space practice does. So this is not the most suitable for the vast majority of beginners, because the concept of practicing, the concept of playing anything already feels difficult. They have not established a practice routine, and so we don't want to jump to the most efficient thing because we're actually just going to turn them off. So we need to be careful with where we recommend this, especially for home practice, and that it's at the right time for that student. Here's some examples of ways I bring this to life for my students. So this is a sheet with just a different illustration, and you see how the colours are supposed to be filled in. So we pick 3 items that we're going to practice, and they should be small chunks, as we generally want students to be practicing, right? So bars 1 to 4 of In the Mirror, a G flat major arpeggio, clapping bars 9 to 12 of Interstellar Ice Cream. Obviously these are all made up titles. Any coincidental comparisons to real pieces are entirely by accident. But we pick 3 different things, and then we colour in the picture in order, basically, by doing the red curly colour. That means play in the mirror. Then we get to colour in that bowl of ice cream, and we keep going like that, filling up the ice cream sundae. Just a little way to visualize what we're doing and to get students used to this idea of switching between different items, and also picking small enough chunks of things that they can do this realistically with. So this is a tool that I would mostly use in lessons. If a student loves it and they want 10 copies to practice that way at home, great, that's fine. But this is mostly a tool to learn about practice in the lesson. We also sometimes use this. Again, it's just a different way to visualize interleaved practice. So in this one, I start with listen and warm up. So I put in, we're making a plan for their week of practice. And we start with something they're supposed to listen to, because I really try to encourage them to listen to music at home. Tougher than it sounds to get kids to do, but it's a great way to start their practice. And then a warm-up, something they're going to do, like a piece they already know well, something that they're going to do to get their fingers moving. And then we have these different patterns. So anywhere where there's the white with the pink almondy shape, they're going to put the same item in all of those spots, and that gives them a plan of what to practice. So they pick 4 things they're going to do, and then they put it in those spots as they repeat. Again, just another way to visualize for them and to be able to map out how this works. Because if you just tell them, okay, we're going to interleave your practice and explain how it works, even if they understand how it works, they're not going to do it. It's too hard. They're going to start practicing probably with their favorite thing that they find the easiest. They're going to spend most of their time on that, and then they're going to get to the rest of their list. And that's not because there's anything wrong with them. It's because they're human, and humans have trouble with change, right? And with doing counterintuitive things, even if we know that they're more efficient. So to make sure we're ultra clear on what this would look like, I've recorded a little video. In the video, I'll show you how blocked practice versus interleaved practice, obviously not spaced practice because that would just be you watching me take a break. That doesn't make any sense. But blocked practice and interleaved practice. And in the video I'm using our Vivid Practice app. That's just so that you can see what's going on and it'll give you a good visual whether you use the app or not. It makes it clear exactly what's going on. So for this example of blocked practice and interleaved practice, we have a very simple list of assignments. Obviously, a student might have a lot more than this, but we just have 3 things: A major arpeggio, B major scale, and a piece called Fox Hop. So we're going to practice first in blocked mode. This means we just have a checklist with all the items. So most students, when they see this checklist, will actually do the piece first. Etc. And they'll probably repeat that a few times, and then they might tick it off their list. Done with that, then they think, oh right, okay, I better do my arpeggio and my scale. So they might run through the arpeggio and then the scale a few times. That last time was probably a more realistic student example. And they would check those off, and then they're done with their practice. So once they've gone through each thing, they're done. That's what blocked mode looks like. If instead they were to interleave their practice, we go into interleave mode. We're going to choose the shortest time, 1 minute, for this example, and select all the items and go let's practice. And now we're going to automatically switch between the different items on the list. So first it tells me to practice A major arpeggio. Got a full minute to do it, so maybe I do hands separate. Maybe I follow my teacher's advice about doing dotted rhythms or something like that. Or maybe I do some improv with, etc. And I continue doing that for a whole minute, or however long the increment is. Now in this case, we're talking about very simple assignments. So a whole minute seems like a lot to work on the A major arpeggio, but depending on what your student is doing, this may seem like a very short amount of time to do something. Then the app is dinging, it's telling me to go to the next thing. So now I've got a minute to work on Fox Hop. So I might do that a couple more times, one more time, depending on the amount of time I've selected, and I spend that amount of time working on Fox Hop. What's inevitably going to happen when a student is working on interleaved practice is they're going to be interrupted. So I'd be in the middle of another repetition of Fox Hop, and it would ding 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 to remind me to switch to the B major scale. Okay, now you might be thinking, okay, they have 3 assignments, they've done 3 minutes of practice, are they done? No, that's the whole point, is that it's going to come back around. And it goes in a random order in the app, or they can be going in a random order by themselves. The idea of interleaved practice is that we're coming back to things again and again. We're giving ourselves a chance to forget the B major scale, in whatever way a student is forgetting their particular assignment that they're working on, and then it will come back around. So it's going to automatically go to something different next out of my list, and I could have a list, remember, of 10 things, depending on what practice level your student is at and the number of assignments you give them, and they could be split up. So now it's gone back to A major, but it could go to any of the other ones each time, and I get a certain amount of time to practice that, and then it goes to the next thing. So it's all about forgetting time and coming back to things when we've had a chance to forget them to make our brain work harder. Okay, so I hope that example helps you get really clear on what this might look like in a real practice situation. I just used the Vivid Practice app to make the example clear of what we're doing so that I could show it on screen. But of course, this can be written notes, it can be the student organising it themselves. There's so many different ways to do it. And there's nothing wrong, as I've said before, with that blocked practice mode. They're practicing everything on their list. I mean, for many students, that's a huge accomplishment and we should be celebrating that. So it's not about every single person doing interleaved practice all the time because it's the most efficient thing, right? So which one do we use and when? So for blocked practice, remember that's just practicing one thing and then the next. That's the checklist option. Sometimes we call it massed practice, as in it's a lot of massed repetitions in one go. For most students, most of the time, this is honestly the right answer. The interleaved practice we're looking at is great, and sometimes we as teachers can get too excited about practice strategies that are really interesting to us, that we wish we knew sooner. But just because we wish we knew it sooner doesn't mean we should have known about it or tried to use it from when we were 6 years old starting lessons, right? So sometimes we go a bit too far. So I just want to put that out there. Most of the students, most of the time, the average student is just going to do blocked practice, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need to make sure that they understand the need to repeat, and you might be surprised about this. So this is one of those things, like having a good instrument at home, like not sitting on a rocking chair while you practice at the piano, true story, that we think is obvious, but that our students or the parents in our studio might not know, because a lot of the things we feel like are common sense are not. They are learned from our many, many, many years of studying this instrument and being in this environment. So do make sure that your students understand the need to repeat. And my favourite way to do this, if I have a beginner student and I've got them into a practice routine, the parents supporting that, and that's great. And I have a little suspicion that they might not be repeating things enough, as in they might be playing everything one time and thinking they're done. Now, of course, I can explain repetition to them, but the most effective way I've found to work on this is I give them just a pack of teeny tiny little stickers, like the little gold stars that you get in a pack of like 1,000, or the tiny little smiley stickers, anything really small. And I give them a page of those. I paper clip it to the piece or to each of their pieces. And I say, okay, very simple. This week, every time you play this piece once, because they're beginners, they're going to play their piece all the way through, right? They're not practicing in sections, most likely. So every time you play their piece, after, you just put one sticker at the top of the page. That's it. That's all I ask them to do. Can we guess how many stickers are on each piece when they come back the next week? Anyone want to guess in the chat? 3, 1. No, remember I said they do have a good practice routine, so it's normally 5. 4 or 5. 25 is what we want, Tina, but that's not happening. 5. 5 is what comes back. And then I say, okay, this explains a lot about why you've been finding this piece difficult. We're now at a stage where you're ready to repeat things lots of times. Of course, we were hoping that they did that all along, but that's the way I'll tell them. They're now ready to repeat things lots of times. So when you come back next week, I want to see 15 new stickers on this piece. And when they hear that number 15, they just think that is totally wild. So it takes a while to build this up, but that's my best way to illustrate it with my younger students who just need to get the point that we really, really, really need to repeat things. We can then start to introduce variety into the repetitions so that they're not just playing it the same way every time. And this is as they progress through levels, as they move up, they need to practice in different ways. Initially, it really is fine for a beginner to practice their very simple 4 to 8 bar piece by just playing it 3 times and being done. Like, that is good enough in the beginning months. But then as we go forward, we need to start to introduce variety and different practice games and make absolutely sure that the routine is established and encourage that checklist mindset. As I said many times, it would be great if every student practiced everything on their list. I'd love to hear in the chat as well if there's something on the list that in your studio always gets somehow forgotten. Like, is it the written homework? Is it a scale? Is it whatever the new piece is? For some students, it's just the new thing. Like, they just want to play the things they've already been playing for a little while. Music theory, technique. I already gave up on written theory. Okay, fair enough, Rosemary. I forgot to do the theory. My thing about the theory, by the way, is that for a lot of us, at least in my studio, I expect like 1 page or maybe 2 pages a week of their theory book. And so it only happens once a week. So it's very easy for them to, each time they practice, say, yeah, I'll get to the theory tomorrow. And then they somehow run out of days to do that little extra bit. Ear training. Yeah, as I said, the listening thing is hard to get students to do for sure. That checklist mindset is not a bad thing, and it's actually what I would encourage for beginners. Then space practice. Remember, this is just literally leaving breaks between repetitions of one of their pieces or of all their practice. They practice each thing once and then they leave a break and then they come back. So this is really good and can come in really handy for your busiest students, especially teenagers. And this is how I practiced as a teenager. So I get to tell them that I know firsthand. Like, I studied for my grade 8, my diploma, all this stuff, practicing in all these tiny chunks because I had serious school exams. I had 1,000 activities a week. I was that teenager, so I do get it. And this is where space practice can really come in handy. My big thing was anytime the kettle was boiling or anytime an ad break was on, I would practice. And, you know, it worked. It really fit in a lot of things. Now, I know not all students are watching regular TV that has ads, but if they are, or if they have watched loads of YouTube and they don't have premium, for example, every time there's a YouTube ad on, they could get up and just do a minute of practice. It's about finding those tiny pockets of time. Getting them over this hump can really discourage and get rid of that all or nothing thinking that a lot of teenagers especially have, some adults as well. They just think, if I say some adults, actually a lot of adult students, they just think if I can't sit down for 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour or whatever it is they have in their head as an appropriate practice time, well, there's no point. And that's just so not true. If that were true, a lot of us wouldn't get any practice time in. So if we can build up this ability to do space practice and do little 5-minute chunks of practice, it gets them out of this way of thinking. And a huge amount can get done in those accumulated 5-minute slots. Again, I know that from experience. For most, the battle is to get any practice slot into a day, especially the kids where the parent is the one organizing everything. They're not going to do those 5-minute chunks. That's unrealistic. And to get one time slot into their day is great. But this is a great option for those students who are time poor, but have the enthusiasm, want to get more done, have big ambitions for their piano playing. This is how they can fit more in a lot of cases, and get really efficient with their practice. Oh, and I'll say also on the space practice and the 5-minute increments, don't be afraid to suggest before school. I used to be reticent to say that because when I was younger, that definitely wouldn't have flown with me. There was no way I was doing anything before school. But some kids really are morning birds, and they will happily and easily practice before school. They're already up early. So always float that as a suggestion because it's worked great for a lot of my students. Okay, interleaved practice then. Remember, we're layering the items or spacing out assignments with other assignments, essentially. So this is generally for students in my studio, intermediate and up. That's when I start to really talk about this. I'm already doing it in my teaching, as we'll get to next, but this is when I start to talk about it for their practice. I want them to at least understand the concept at this stage, but I don't want to risk efficiency with my students who struggle with grit. Interleaved practice is not for those who give up easily, who are easily put off. It makes things harder, as we've said. That hardness, that difficulty, is actually a desirable difficulty. It makes things more efficient. But if it's going to make it harder and therefore discourage the student from practicing or cause them to quit piano, that's not what we want. So we do want to be judicious with our use of this strategy and be careful with your students who you know struggle with their grit. You'll see that in their lessons if they are having difficulty sticking with things. This is for when they want to absolutely maximize their results. It's also for your own practice, and it doesn't have to be for every practice, either for you or for them. It's one tool in our toolkit. We know it makes things more efficient. If you want to get things done, the maximum amount done in your own practice, in your 30 minutes or whatever you can scrounge in your day, then interleaved practice can be great. Same for your students. But if it's going to discourage you from practicing at all, it's okay to give it a rest for 1 day or 2 days out of the week. Just remember our forgetting curve and how we have to pick these things back up within a given amount of time. And some kind of illustration like this, or the train story I told you earlier, can help students to understand how this fits in, how this affects their practice and how they make progress. I really want students to understand these little bits of neuroscience, because when they understand that, it encourages a growth mindset. It makes sure they know that it's not because they're useless, because they're unmusical, because they're silly, whatever word they choose to describe themselves. It's nothing to do with them that is making them not get better at the same rate as one of their peers, or not be able to do X exam, or perform a piece that they want to in the recital. The reason they can't do that is because of the way they're practicing, and there's always a way to get better at practicing. Okay, I've given it a big break now. Do we remember? I'm watching to see if anyone mouths it. I think some people have it. Okay, I'll tell you. Go rev ma agat. And I think I saw Kim mouth the right thing there. Gumaleshgale. Gumaleshgale. All right, when we understand all of that, that's where we can bring this into our teaching. And I'm putting this at the end of the presentation because you have to understand the interleaved practice component in order to put this in practice. But this is the most powerful thing. If your students never do any interleaved practice, I think that's okay. I think it's a great strategy to introduce to them, but I think this can make an even bigger difference in your teaching if you apply it in your lessons. This will make your students retain information better. Like, we want students to remember from week to week what we did, and most of us don't get to see our students every day, so that is always going to be a challenge. It also avoids perfectionism, because you're going to come back to things again and again in the lesson. You're going to essentially interrupt your students before they get it perfect. It gets them to make more mistakes in a safe environment in the lesson where they know you're there to support them and help them through those mistakes. It will make you clearer about your own teaching, what you want to achieve, how you want to address things. And it will also align your expectations of what you think a student can achieve in their practice time, in a week, in a lesson. because you get to see how much knowledge is retained when you come back to something even 10 minutes later. And hopefully that will give you a little reality check. If they've totally forgotten that rote piece you were trying to teach them 10 minutes later, I'm sorry, but they cannot practice it at home. It's not going to happen. So it can really give us a reality check in a good way. And the more realistic we are about our teaching, the more we really know what's going on, the better we can be as a teacher, the more efficient we can be. So, the eagle-eyed, those writing down every single word I've put on the screen, which I hope you weren't, but if you were, you would know that this is the same plan that I showed earlier for the interleaved practice. I've just extended some of the times a little bit to make it a lesson length-ish. Now, this is the extreme version. I'm not actually saying you have to do this right away, but you can, and it's a good experiment to try. To really interleave your lesson, you need to be very strict with yourself. You need to write out probably initially a framework like this. I'm going to spend this many minutes on this many minutes on that. For many people, it can be helpful to literally write out the time it's going to be. I know this sounds very like militant and regimented, but it's just an experiment that you try every so often. So your lesson starts at 3:30, then by 3:32, you're going to be doing Bluesy Dude, etc. And you write it out that way. That can be a useful thing to do. And likely you won't get to everything you thought you would, because we do get sidetracked. We do get bogged down in details. But when you know you're coming back to something later, it can sometimes help you to be able to let things go. And one of the big things I do see in a lot of teachers teaching is that they can't let things go, because we can see everything that is quote unquote wrong with a piece when a student is playing it. So they play the piece, and an experienced teacher, the longer you've been teaching, I think part of the equation is deciding, what am I going to fix now? What am I going to fix later? And which things am I going to totally let go because the student is not ready to talk about the phrasing in this piece, or whatever the case may be. You have to select some things that it's just okay that it's not perfect, because there's no such thing as perfect anyway, and they have to keep moving forward in order to learn. When we're doing interleaved teaching, we get to come back to those things again. So I think it's a good way to illustrate to yourself and to get into the practice of, okay, I have 4 minutes to work on this piece. I'm going to ask them to play a couple of lines that I think are where there might be a problem. And then I'm going to try and fix that one problem, whatever the case may be, a fingering issue, a dynamic marking that they're missing. You pick one thing. And then when you come back to it later, you see whether you've actually made any headway on that problem, whether they can tell you where their fingering is supposed to be, whether they can accurately reproduce it, whatever the issue is that you tried to fix. So it's a reality check, and it also helps you plan and prioritize in your teaching more effectively. Now, let's be real. Most teachers don't teach this way. And I'm not suggesting you do it every day of every week either, but it is a really good experiment to try and to gradually come to a compromise with some amount of interleaving in your teaching rather than doing the whole thing in the example I just showed. Most teachers don't do this though because they like to, or they can't resist doggedly pursuing something. Like the student is not getting that bit, and you just have them repeat it again and again because you're convinced that they are going to get it the next time. We're kind of infamous for saying just one more time and not meaning it, right? This is why. It's because we're like, no, they can get it the next time. And then they don't. And you're like, well, just one more. Just one more. Sometimes it's okay to let things go and come back to them later. You have to trust your student and yourself that you're going to be able to do it later. And they often will do better when they haven't just been playing it already 20 times. 21 times is not the magic number. We need to move on and come back to it later. But you also need to be on the ball with time management. You need to be so aware of your time. And I know this is very challenging, more challenging for some people than for others. I think it's a skill that you can build like any other. There's very few things I believe are actually innate in people and can't be improved. We all start from some place in terms of time management, but I think we can improve upon it. So if this is something you really struggle with, I'd encourage you to think about planning out your lessons in terms of minutes, just as an experiment, and seeing how much you can stick to it. Initially, you'll put way too much stuff on there, and eventually you'll learn how to plan it more efficiently. So where do we start? I actually don't think you should start with the full framework I laid out before, the full example I laid out before. That's one way to do it if you're like, yes, I want to really do this for a full week as an experiment. But if you need an easier start, just start with one thing. This is the simplest form of interleaving and it is so effective. Pick one thing. And I would suggest if you are teaching rote pieces, pick that. That's the simplest option. That's my easy answer for you. Just pick the rote piece. Teach a small part of the rote piece, do something else, ask them to play the rote piece again and again and again in between every other activity you do. Or you can pick something that's honestly getting on your nerves. Like for some reason, this student can just not remember to start the B major scale on their fourth finger, and it's driving you crazy. Well, have them do it in between every single thing and it won't be a problem anymore because they'll be forgetting a little bit, recalling the information, forgetting it, recalling it, and that is how you will build up that ability for them to remember it long term. Once you're comfortable just doing one thing and repeating it throughout the lesson, then you can add a little bit more in. You can start layering a lot of the stuff you do, but you don't have to jump all in right away. You can take little baby steps. And a little tip that helps you to do all of this is to not let your students be the one to organize their own books. I know this might seem off topic, but it really is the thing that gets in the way for a lot of teachers. I've observed a lot of teachers, and they will ask their student to pull out books. And I get it. It seems logical. But if you're trying to do that, and especially if you're trying to do that and interleave your teaching, it's not going to happen. What you need to do is get in the habit of opening the book to the page while your student is playing the other piece, so you can just pop it right in front of them. And that's how you alternate quickly between things. Remember, finally, that this is not for everyone. This is not the only way to teach, or to learn, or to practice. Yes, it is very efficient. That doesn't mean it has to be every lesson or every practice session. Pay attention to your student and how they respond. Teach them the way that they need. They always come first above anything else. We want to make sure to respond to how they are. Not by asking them, hey, do you want to switch back and forth between those pieces? They're going to say no. But if you try it as an experiment with a student and you find they're really finding this frustrating, they're getting annoyed, they're finding this too difficult, they're not having fun in their lesson, then you don't have to do it. The wonderful thing is we're not beholden to any school curriculum or observations from different people that tell us how to do our job. We get to decide how to do it. So this is just one more experiment you can try. I've found it to be really interesting for my own teaching. And after trying it as maybe a bigger experiment where I had to be very conscious of trying to put this into my teaching, it's something I naturally do. I don't have to think about this anymore. I'm getting something ready for a student and ask them to play their rote piece again, or come back to their scale, or I alternate between pieces. It's something that just feels like the usual flow of a lesson to me by now, but initially it does take a little bit of a push, but I think that's what we're all here for, is to keep trying new things and improving our teaching. Thank you very much for listening. And I would love to hear questions. I know there's some things in the chat that I haven't seen, so I'll get to those first, but any other questions, please let me know and I will come back on to say hi and answer any questions you might have, or just topics you want to bring up. by the way, as far as I'm concerned, if it's a bit off topic, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be very specifically on interleaved teaching or interleaved practice. Dina said, I forgot to practice that one, even though, all caps, even though it was written on their practice sheet, which to me means they didn't practice at all. Well, they didn't look at their practice sheet at all. Let's be fair. A lot of people don't look at their practice sheets, if we're honest. I would love actually to hear from people, if your teacher, when you were growing up, your teacher used a notebook or practice sheet or some other way of writing down the information of what you're to practice. We're going to be higher than average, but tell me, did you read it every day before you practice? Did you really do it? I would love to hear. I didn't. So I'll own up right away. I don't think I ever looked in the notebook in between lessons. Rosemary said, space practice works wonders with busy teens. Anytime they were in the room or passing the piano, just do one thing. Yes, exactly. That's another good trigger. Like I said, the kettle boiling or the ad break is on. Anytime you walk past the piano can be a really good, just little trigger. Well, I passed the piano, I have to play something. Doesn't have to be for long, but they have to play something. Yes, absolutely. Carla said, for practicing memory, it's helpful to jump between memory checkpoints to test recall instead of practicing the piece most linearly. Yeah. If we're going to play a piece for memory, I love to do jumps as well. So they start playing their piece and I say jump. This is a Graham Fitch thing. I think that's where I got it from. And they have to jump to... Sorry, I'm getting mixed up. It's a mixture between a Graham Fitch thing and a Christina Whitlock thing, just to give credit where it's due. But they jump to the next point that we've designated like a good starting spot. So like a start of a phrase or a section. And that's another way to work through it. Or do them random order, lots of things like that. Juliana, does reviewing all the content at the end of the lesson count as interleaved teaching? That's an interesting one. How much are we reviewing it is my counter question. Because if we're quickly just saying for like a minute or two, oh, we did this and then we did that, my answer is definitely no. But if you're going to redo everything, then technically it's interleaved teaching. But generally we would call it interleaving when there's more than 2 times that you're doing something, right? So it's like you're coming back a few times spaced out with other things. But in a way, technically, maybe yes. Jenna, you're welcome. Glad you enjoyed it. Thank you, Peggy. Aldous said, for adult students who do practice at home and want to focus on a few pieces, would interleaved practice work for that student? Yes, absolutely. Especially for our more analytical adult students. Like we have some students who really, adult students sometimes get really, really involved and they can be very diligent about following practice strategies. I mean, they can be a dream student in some of these ways, and some of them do want to have like a good chunk of time. Some adults are very busy and they can't do that, but we have a lot of adults who would say they practice 45 minutes every day, you know? And if they're doing that, why not help them make it more efficient? I think absolutely it's great for adult students. Notebook, nope.
One of the questions that came up earlier and actually later on was for those with ADD, would interleaved practice make their inability to focus longer or worse?
Yes. Thank you for bringing that back up. I did see that and I'd forgotten to come back to it. Yes. So for students with ADD or ADHD, as we call it here, would it make their inability to focus better or worse? I don't think it's going to affect how well or poorly they focus. However, I would say for many students with ADHD, it's not a good idea. So interleaved practice means you have to context switch all the time. And for someone with ADHD, that's generally a nightmare. So most of my students with ADHD, this is something when I talk about neurodivergent students and stuff, it's one of the clarifications I always make, because a lot of people, when they first take on students with ADHD, they think, oh, I'm going to have to switch activities like all the time. I'm going to have to bam, 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 bam. That's more of a strategy for preschoolers than it is for ADHD students. Our students with ADHD usually prefer to settle into a task because that adjustment time is tough. And then once they're in it and they stick with it for a long time. So in general, no, interleaved practice does not work very well for ADHD students. However, I do have one I can think of right now where it definitely is helpful to come back and do a little bit of something. So more like the example I gave where I'm just picking one thing that needs to be reviewed a lot, like a B major scale or a rote piece, and coming back and doing that as like a transition activity between each thing and interleaving in that kind of semi-way does work for some students with ADHD.
Can I make a suggestion? Because I
Yes.
do this with my students. Okay, so a variation of it could be that, because I tried this with some of my students that have ADD, ADHD, and yeah, it was an unmitigated failure. So what we do is I say, okay, you can do as many repetitions as you want, but you need to listen carefully. And so the second that I hear them, they start to lose focus, or if they've mastered something and they can fix the next thing, I'll just say, wait, before you play it, try this now. Or, okay, I think you're losing focus. Why don't we move on? We can always come back to it later. And so then that way they have the ownership, but you're not held to a rigid timeline, but you can still do it and you're coming back to it later. But they have more control over it. So just as an idea.
Yes, absolutely. And to add on to that, if you have ADHD students who tend to repeat things over and over and over and over and over and over and over, if you've had students with ADHD, I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about. A good rule that I like to bring in, which is not connected to interleaved practice, but just based on what Rosemary was talking about, is the hands have to come off the piano and onto the lap in between each repetition. Because that encourages just that second of thinking time so that it doesn't become just this like... I have a student in particular at the moment who has ADHD and with scales, she will just up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And it just gets faster and faster and faster and therefore worse and worse and worse. And it really has to be a rule that we have to play it once, take our hands off, play it again if we want to, take our hands off. So, yeah, can be a struggle. Interesting notes on the notebook. Thank you for sharing those. Sabrina, then you're a dream music parent. I had my own children rewrite what they covered in lessons and what to focus on the car ride home from lessons. I mean, I tried, this is a practice habit I try to get parents to do in my studio. Not necessarily rewriting, but just like reading the assignments together after the lesson when you get home. Makes a big difference. Again, it's all about that forgetting curve.
So one person had asked about the vivid practice. Do they fill it in like a lesson sheet, kind of? Like we saw that they had examples. So basically for the scale or the arpeggio, it's like you could do it these ways. Is the teacher filling that in?
Yeah, so the way vivid practice works is the teacher uses the website and they have like all their students on the website and they organize what assignments they have. And you have a saved library of assignments, or you can fill them out as you go. So for like my own studio, most of the things my students do, it's already in my library. So during the lesson, I'm just clicking to add it. And I already have like the notes of what I would say to most students as practice advice for the week and the attached audio or video or whatever is relevant. And then I can just edit it in the lesson. So that's the way I give practice notes. So I don't use a notebook or anything like that anymore. And then whenever I've put in their list, basically that's what shows up in the app for them. And the app is what you were seeing there is like what the student would see on their end. So it's very simple. They just use that to practice. Or they can just, at the start of that video, I just tapped view only to just show the assignments. So for some students, they their parent or they don't want to use a screen during their practice, and that's fine. They just have view only, look at what they need to do, close the app, that's fine.
And then, yeah, Madison has a question for you at the end there as well, in terms of beginners.
How would interleaved teaching work for beginner young students, 5 to 6 years old, that are only working on a lesson and a workbook? Or would it be best not to use this method until they are a little bit more advanced? No, if we're talking about the lesson, interleaved teaching, absolutely I would use it with my youngest students. This is actually a big thing that comes across when I'm talking to teachers about teaching young kids, teaching like the under 7 crowd, is I'll often talk about, okay, you need shorter times at things, like you need to move on. Stop getting stuck at the piano for 10 minutes. You need to move between this and that. But that doesn't mean that you're actually not covering the piece enough, because you come back to it again and again. So actually with my youngest students is almost when I use interleaved teaching the most consistently, because they need to keep switching activities. Most young kids, these are all generalizations, but for most of my younger students, it's very helpful to do 2 minutes at the piano, get up and dance to the next piece we're going to be learning, go back to the piano and do that piece again. All of this stuff will help them to stay focused. They just need to move and change things often in most cases. Good discussion about the ADHD as well. If anyone else has any questions, let me know, and feel free to just like unmute yourself and interrupt me if you want to speak your question. That's fine too.
Aldous has a question about ESL. So a lot of beginner students, English as a second language, many of their parents speak little English. So what are some tips for encouraging practice for them?
I'd like to ask a follow-up, I guess, which is about what is specifically standing in their way. Like any of my families where the parents' English is not as good, it is a common experience that the children end up, organizing their own time a little bit more with stuff like this. But I've never had anything stand in the way in terms of practice. I will say that I meet with all parents before they start in my studio. So that would be a really important component of this parent relationship piece, is before they can start lessons, they have to come here for, it's like 10 minutes, but it's just a chat. In Canada, you'd probably call it a visit, right? So they come in for a visit and the student doesn't have to be there, but they can be. But it's my opportunity to make sure the parents understand what's going on, not just in terms of English, but in terms of like their music background, everything, and make sure that we're on the same page and they understand their role in practice. Their role in practice is not to understand the music or even the practice notes. They should be written in a language that's appropriate for the age of the student to understand. But their role is to be the adult, and they're capable of that, which is they organize the time, they help the students stick to doing it every day, they help them to check the things off the list or whatever the case may be. So if you have a follow-up question, or if I didn't answer your question, let me know. Carlo had a suggestion: make analogies that connect to their culture or language. So for example, if you're teaching counting, use fruits, food, places, animals, etc. that are native to their culture. It'll make it stick better. Yeah. I guess that's more if the student has recently immigrated, where their reference points are more from wherever they moved from. I think that can be helpful for sure. But mostly it's about speaking the language of music, to be honest. So I've never had language stand in the way in lessons, I think.
If anybody has any other questions, obviously feel free. But I know that Nicola has a JDOT approach, just do one thing. She'd mentioned it. So maybe once, as Marion gets her question answered here, maybe what's the one strategy from today that you want to try first, right? So drop it in the chat if you'd like to share. I love that Nicola said that this doesn't have to be you don't have to do all of this every lesson. So what's your JDOT? I know I'd be interested in hearing that.
Yeah, absolutely. JDOT, just do one thing. Because I find, especially in the internet age, we can get overwhelmed with all the possibilities and feel like every teacher is doing all the things and we're so boring and because we're not doing all the things all at once. And nobody is doing all the things all at once. You can only try one new thing at a time. So I would love to hear that. That's a great prompt, Rosemary. Thank you, Cheryl. I'm glad you enjoyed the in-person sessions. Several years ago now. But it was such a pleasure to be over there with you all.
Marion did have a question about what you discussed in your pre-lesson meeting.
Sure, yeah. Are there some questions? Oh, yeah. What did you discuss with the parent in your visit prior to starting lessons? Okay, so a lot of things. I said it's usually only 10 minutes. Sometimes it's longer, but we cover a lot of ground. So I have a few questions that I ask them when they're even booking the meeting. I have them book the meeting through a Calendly link, and I actually have a few questions on there that they answer first, which kind of sets up some things. Like, I ask them about whether they're going to be able to sit with their child when they practice, if they're transferring from another teacher, what was their reason for moving from that teacher, just a little bit of context. So I have that information before the meeting. And then in the meeting, I'm doing things like making sure their home instrument is appropriate. That's best done in person. So I have the meeting in our little waiting room here, which conveniently has a Yamaha P105. So just like a basic digital piano with the pedal unit. And I have that directly behind me to reference as like, this is the minimum thing. What does yours look like? Or if you're getting something, it needs to look like this. Please send me the link to anything you're considering. So we have a lot of chat about the home instrument and that kind of setup. And then I explain a little bit about what we do in the studio, how it's a little bit different than other lessons they may have either taken themselves or been familiar with, like the fact that we do improvisation, the fact that we play games. Many parents are coming to us specifically because we do that, but I can't guarantee how much of our website they've read. So I make sure to lay all of that out. And then I talk to them about practice. And one of the things I say, I don't know whether this is verbatim, but I say something to the effect of, I know you want piano to be fun for your child. The thing about piano is it's more fun when you practice. So I just make sure to set that up right away to make sure there isn't a preconception that if their child has fun, then they will practice. That's not how it works. They have to structure the practice. I talk to them about, based on their individual circumstances, when they might be able to make that happen. We have a little bit of a chat about that, and I'm really just watching their reaction, making sure they're sincere, that they really mean it, that they really understand what I'm saying, that they're not just nodding along. And I think that makes a big difference. And then there's a lot of follow-up after that. Like I have automatic emails that go out to them to follow up on all of the things that we've covered in the meeting. The only other thing that we cover in the meeting is like basic studio stuff as well. Like, this is how payments work. This is our calendar that we follow and that kind of stuff. And performances. It's basically an introduction to everything in the studio, as well as a practice chat.
There's some really great JDOTs, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh,
Dina's going to interleave her own practice. Love that. Interleave the problem memory challenges. Excellent, Peggy. Love that. Yeah, we really do get stuck. I'll throw this out there, by the way, since I say it in almost every presentation I give, but I won't stop. If you really want to improve your own teaching, make sure you're not getting stuck on particular pieces or asking students to repeat things one more time over and over again without realizing it. And if you want to improve your own time management in lessons, the best thing you can do is record your own teaching, video record your teaching, and watch it. So I'll just throw that out there. Not everybody takes me up on this because people don't like watching themselves on video. Nobody does, by the way. Nobody likes listening to their own voice, but it is so worth it. And so I have another couple of teachers who work here, run a small multi-teacher studio here. And thank you, Carlo. And we record our teaching, all of us, for 3 designated weeks out of the year. So I just put it on our calendar, like lesson recording week, spaced out 3 times in the year. We record an entire week, and we have to watch our own teaching, and I watch theirs as well. So it's a lot of work to get through all of that watching time, but it is so important. And the things you spot when you watch yourself or when you watch another teacher are so informative. And it is stuff like, you're basically yelling at yourself. I mean, you try to be kind to yourself, but sometimes you're just sitting there going, stop talking. Why are you still talking? Why are you still talking? Or, why have you asked them to do that again? They're clearly not getting it. Like, try something else. What are you doing? And we all have that moment, but it helps us to really hone in on what areas we need to improve and see it in action. It's interesting you mentioned Pomodoro, Marion. 25 minutes focus on one task, 5-minute break. That's actually another of the practice modes that's built into the app that I was showing in the interleaved example, is we have a Pomodoro mode, because for some students that's the biggest thing, is they don't ever take a break and they can get too stuck in something and they don't give themselves any time to look at a different distance. Like, that's big for your eyes and being able to focus on sheet music. If you're always focused right here, it's not great. Especially adult students who, they might struggle with eyesight or whatever, just keeping your focus right here, it's not good. And yeah, being able to remember to take a sip of water, to think about things, or whatever you do with your break. I think, it's really important.
Does anyone have any further questions? I loved the JDOTs. I was making a note of those because they're just awesome. Let's see, slightly different. Oh, Rachel is saying, did you want to read that one, or do you want me to?
Sure. Slightly different way of Use Interleaved practice is to have 3 things to work on in one piece. Yes, you can interleave within one piece as well. That's like, obviously for bigger pieces, more advanced students or ourselves. Then interleave practicing those 3 things before moving on to the next piece. Not quite as good as forgetting time, but easier to apply. Yeah, I mean, I still think it's great for having a little bit of forgetting time. It's definitely more efficient than practicing each chunk without ever revisiting them, at least alternating between them. Makes our brain work that little bit harder all the time.
And I would say, having done the interleaved practice myself, I usually make sure there's something fun at the end for me. And so, like, I have a Piano Guys lead sheet book, or like a fake book. And so if I do my interleaved practice, then I was like, okay, and I just need, right? But it's a good reminder for me as a teacher, like, what am I asking my students to do? And so, yeah, that's usually what I tell my students. I'm like, I know, but you want to make progress, do this thing, and then do something fun, whatever that might be. So
yeah,
hopefully that helps.
Absolutely, just the playing. I mean, it's something I talk about with my students a lot, is like what practicing is versus playing. Like, what's the difference? And that doesn't mean you're not supposed to play, but sometimes it does mean you need to save it for the end of your practice session, because otherwise you will only play, and then we're not really making progress towards our goals.
It kind of looks like questions have dried up. I think you might have answered everyone's questions. The JDOTs were fantastic. I know I am looking forward to hearing, hopefully, from teachers, whether they have been able to follow through on them. Oh, you got a heart. I love it when my students do that. Actually, one of my students, when she does something well, she does a good rep. I do cookies. And she goes, cookies! They teach online. So yeah, just keep an eye on your inbox for any announcements. We've got stuff happening all over the province, and then also stuff coming up online. I know I learned a lot, and I loved the examples you gave. Like, it just kind of helped me visualize what it can look like with each student.
Well, it was my pleasure. I hope it was helpful, and it's just always so fun to hang out with APTA people. They're the best.